The bottom line is they've never been bloody number one in the world.
Hello and welcome to episode 26 of Radio Cricket for the week beginning Monday 29th October 2012. This is episode 26. That is 26, the same number of people who tuned into the Champions League T20 final. I'm Nishant Joshi and I'm joined today by the master blaster of satirical disaster. It is the one, the only, James Marsh.
Yes, Nishant, well, I was a proud member of that 26, but how are you? I expect you're reeling from the news Brad Haddin has been left out of the Australian Test squad for the first match against South Africa, but apart from that, how are you doing?
Well, I've just about been coping with that terrible, tragic news, as I'm sure Brad Haddin has. I'm sure the 2.5 million kitty that he won for the Sydney Sixers just yesterday will soften the blow somewhat. But yeah, I've been doing very well, James. Last week we actually had a pediatrics rotation, so that involved looking at a lot of newborn babies, examining them. It was humanizing almost to just see life in its purest form for a change, rather than examine old crusty people, which we've been doing for the past 4 years. But I mean, it did kind of remind me of something, because all the babies, they were whining, crying, and baby-faced, always complaining about something, never happy. It did remind me more than a little of Stuart Broad.
Well, speaking of poor old Stuart and perhaps the impurity of human nature, Nishant, I should ask you about the dispute between the BCCI and Sky and the BBC. As we speak, it seems like neither Sky or the BBC are going to have a commentary team in India for the series coming up. So have you been following this, Nishant? How has it come about? It seems quite extraordinary we're in this situation, quite so close to the series starting.
Well, there still are 2 or 3 weeks before the India versus England test matches, but I think it does seem like a lot of brinksmanship and, for want of a better word, penis waving by the BCCI, which is very unlike them, of course. So obviously you've got the likes of N. Srinivasan with his old toddler out, effectively slapping Giles Clarke in the face with it. The BCCI have actually asked Sky to fork out £500,000 extra for their broadcasting costs, and they've asked the BBC for £50,000 for their broadcasting rights as well, and neither party has agreed to it. And it's all a bit like going to a restaurant and being charged for a meal that you never even ordered. So it does seem a bit like the BCCI is trying to take the British broadcasters for a ride. Perhaps it's some sort of misplaced sense of revenge that the BCCI are just showing who's boss. There still are 2 or 3 weeks before the first test actually takes place, but at the moment it does seem like we won't have to endure the likes of Jonathan Agnew and Henry Blofeld on air, who, in my humble opinion, are the myopic dinosaurs of cricket.
Well, goodness, Nishant. Well, I mean, I think there are moves afoot to try and resolve the issue. I wasn't quite so aware as you of the lengths that Giles Clarke and then Srinivasan were going to try and sort things out. I think Giles Clarke has just sent an email rather than been slapped around the face by any protuberance from Srinivasan's body. But I must admit I'd be more confident of Imran Khan being made the next US Secretary of State than those two managing to come to an agreement. As you say, the BCCI are demanding £500,000 from Sky, and they're demanding an extra 50,000 from the BBC. I think the disparity involved in those figures is obviously, firstly, because television production is massively more expensive, and secondly, because Ravi Shastri still thinks Nasser Hussain is a prick. It all does seem to have gone very, very quiet, but we have to hope the 4 entities involved, the BCCI, the BBC, Sky and the ECB, are beavering away behind closed doors, but I'm not sure how much hope we can hold out. And Nishant, the phony war pre-series has opened up on another front, because England are due to play India A in Mumbai on Tuesday, yet the BCCI have failed to select a specialist spinner. This is a decision which David Lloyd has labelled totally lacking in class and style. And, you know, I tend to agree with him. This is very nefarious indeed. You know, when India were in England in 2011, the ECB gave India one warm-up match in which 23-year-old Max Waller bowled 5.2 overs of spin at them. So it's completely lacking in any sort of reciprocal decency from the BCCI. Nishant, what do you make of the whole business?
Well, if they really wanted to reciprocate by playing shit spinners, then I'm sure that Ravi Jadeja and Piyush Chawla were available, but they've obviously turned them down for this case. I think that inviting guests to your home and not playing a spinner in their 3 practice matches, which is what I assume India will do now. It's a bit like inviting guests to your home for soup night and only offering them forks. So I think it is a bit of gamesmanship gone too far in this case by the Indians.
Well, possibly so. I mean, I was being somewhat flippant in my introduction there, but I
Never.
think I'm probably of the opposite opinion, because I've seen England collapse to spin so often on the subcontinent in the last couple of years that I think perhaps India have maybe missed a trick by not trying to start the mental disintegration process early doors. I mean, I still have a slightly irrational love of Amit Mishra, who's actually been taking a few wickets in Indian domestic cricket, so I would have quite liked to have seen him come in. I did read this week, Nishant, that Nick Compton likes batting in the dark against the bowling machine.
Yeah.
So it sounds like maybe he's already brought into the team ethos of England's strategy for playing against spin. Nishant, what do you think? Do you think that Ashwin and Oja will be rubbing their hands together at the thought of England not getting any practice against spinners?
Well, to be honest, I think 3 practice matches against decent spin might have helped the likes of Nick Compton acclimatise to the conditions, but I mean the rest of the touring group from England's point of view is pretty experienced in subcontinental conditions as well, and still they haven't managed to ever really convince us that they can play spin effectively. For example, earlier on in this year when they collapsed against Pakistan in the three test series, they were absolutely hopeless. So who's to say that 3 matches against spin would help them at all? And now to South Africa, where the Champions League T20 was won yesterday by the Sydney Sixers of Australia, led by Brad Haddon, a good friend of the podcast, and featuring the likes of Steve Smith, Moises Henriques, Michael Lum. I think the Sydney Sixers did an exceptional job considering that Shane Watson had to leave before the semi-finals, and really it kind of just showed the depth that the Sydney team has. It's quite remarkable that even without Shane Watson they had Nathan McCullum come in as his replacement, and he did alright as well. They have some really promising players like Stephen O'Keefe. I can't understand for the life of me how Stephen O'Keefe can't get into the Australian T20 side or ODI side ahead of Xavier Doherty. I think they really were a class apart in this tournament, and I think the tournament did have its critics. I'm not sure how many people tuned in once the IPL teams bombed out quite early on, but I think it was watchable at times. It wasn't the best cricket, but it was watchable. What do you think, James?
Well, yes, I actually quite enjoyed the Champions League, although I think because I finally succumbed to a sort of T20 Stockholm syndrome, Nishan. I was always a little bit reticent about the format, but I think after being bundled into the back of a van by numerous IPLs, tied to a radiator by Ravi Shastri, and then more recently just fed a diet of Gangnam Style and quite disappointing cheerleaders in both the World T20 and Champions League, I've finally come to love my captor. So there weren't really that many standout matches, although there was a tremendous semi, ironically not involving de Kock, between the Sydney Sixers and the Titans. There were a couple of players who it was nice to sort of get tabs on. I was ignorant of before, not least Vangiso, the left-arm spinner. Although in the final his bowling got more battered than a Marsh brother on a stag party, he otherwise performed very well indeed, getting some prize scalps, Tendulkar, Watson, even more impressively Ravi Jadeja, Nishan. And I hope he might develop in South African domestic cricket rather than just fade back away after the razzmatazz. Also Michael Lum, it was nice to see him doing well and restoring the reputation of English T20 batting, albeit that he was born in South Africa, and I quite like to see him coming back into the England setup, if only because his inclusion would possibly make Malcolm Conn's pom-hating head spontaneously combust in a bloody pussy frenzy of horror.
Well, speaking of Ravi Jadeja, we've been talking a lot about the unfairness and discrepancies between the IPL sides, and the playing field is about as level as the Titanic as she was going down. I think the stat that stands out for me here is that Ravi Jadeja earns twice as much in the IPL as the entire Sydney Sixers team does during the entire Big Bash League. So even if you go by conservative estimates of $2 million plus a bit on the side, he really is taking the mick there. And the thing is, Ravi Jadeja only scored 40 runs in 4 knocks during the Champions League, and he got walloped with the ball as well. So really, I think Jadeja has won life's lottery.
Well, quite. Well, never less it be said that T20 franchise cricket is driven by money rather than talent, Nishant.
Wouldn't dream of it, James. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Radio Cricket. We do hope you join us again this time next week. I have been Nishant Joshi.
And I've been James Marsh, and after the latest wranglings between English and Indian cricket, I leave you with a quote from Oscar Wilde, who said, "I never played cricket. It requires one to assume such indecent postures. Goodbye."
I think it was a very poor performance, one of the worst things I have ever seen done on a cricket field. Good night.